This is the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Andy Payton is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. Randy Moore is associate pastor at Methodist Temple. Their goal is to see Christ in everything and everyone.
Welcome to the podcast, everybody. I'm Pastor Randy Moore, joined as always by Pastor Andy Payton. We are the pastors at the Methodist Temple, United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. For those of you who are not members of our community, we realize most of you probably are, but undoubtedly there are those who have somehow found our podcast, Pastor Andy, and so that's who we are in a nutshell. Andy is the senior pastor here, and I'm associate. Good to sit down with you again here between the third and fourth Sundays in Easter.
Yes. It's always fun to get together and have this conversation. And I feel like, Randy, I get as much out of doing this as maybe anyone because it forces me to stop and reflect. And then the fun thing about it, or the exciting thing about it, would be that other people join in and come alongside us. And so I have to say, like, over the last couple of weeks, I've had random people coming up to me saying, boy, we really enjoyed the podcast. We get so much out of the podcast. And I mean, that's encouraging, I guess you could say.
So yes, and spread the word. The more the merrier. And as always, you're welcome to join us in person and become a part of our community if that would be something that you're able and willing to do. We're just happy to have you for the podcast. And essentially what we do is we don't get in any hurry to get past last week's message. We go back and we delve maybe a little bit deeper into it. I think that alone is a good exercise. We've mentioned it before that we can go to church on Sunday and it can be a wonderful worship service, and then it can quickly fade into the background. It's just the way life goes. Even the best sermon or the best service can kind of fade away. And so to stay with it for a little while and ask some questions about it is a good practice. And that's what we do, and we look forward to the next session. As we begin talking about how our souls are faring, I wanted to mention in my own case that it's done my soul well to have taken in a few more people into our contemplative prayer class. This is something that I started, and I know you've also in the past have led contemplative prayer groups, but I started this one shortly after I got here almost 3 years ago. And it began with a 4-week workshop, which was really well attended, and it ended up with 2 contemplative prayer groups, one on a weekday morning and another on a Sunday evening. The one on the weekday morning, it didn't last, but we still, the Sunday evening one did, and last Sunday we had a one-time workshop for anyone else. This is the first time we've ever really formally like that invited people in to take a look. And we had some new people, and that was good.
Well, I mean, contemplative prayer has been so life-giving for me. The idea of contemplation, the mystical journey when it comes to the Christian faith is just, I mean, to me, that's where it's at.
Right.
When we talk about, what are we trying to convey here on this podcast? What is the belief? What are the beliefs? What's the software we're trying to communicate? It's this idea of contemplation, and people think, sit in silence? What? And no, it's about contemplation. What's so, I'm trying to find the right word here.
Well,
transformative about it is that it invites us to come to an experiential awareness of God's presence in our lives.
It's about a relationship.
Yes. You're moving past the words now. I mean, so often I think within the life of Christianity, or any religion for that matter, we have this tendency to mistake the container for the content, or, the symbol for the substance. And what I mean by that is we just get lost in the distinctions, like, well, it says this and it says that, and this person says this and this person says that. And it could be this like ongoing debate about who's right, but at the end of the day, like, okay, that's great. We're having these conversations about these distinctions and about these words and ideas. That's not a bad thing, but at some point you have to move past that into the experience of. And that's what contemplation is trying to do, to get us past all the chatter, get us into the experience of God's love and God's presence.
I shared with the group on Sunday what drew me to contemplative prayer, and I did that by, first of all, sort of establishing my biblical credentials, that I'm a Bible person. I didn't want to be mistaken at all. I am a Bible person. The church requires us as pastors to know the Bible and to teach the Bible. I'm a Bible guy. But I know, too, that God is still speaking. And God did not stop speaking when they closed the biblical canon. And for me, while I love the Bible and I find God and hear God and see God in Scripture, I want a relationship that is real. And while it is wordless, there's just something about it that it contributes to the living God in our lives. And that the wordless part of it, I think, is what people have a hard time getting over, especially in 21st century America. We're all about words. And so a lot of people are like, I don't quite get it. It just seems like you're supposed to pray for 20 minutes. It's like in silence. It's like, nothing happened. And so that's hard for us.
What's my return on investment? That's the Western mind, right?
Yeah.
Like the consumer mind is like, what's my return here? What's my reward? And there is a reward, though. There really is, in the sense that you might not experience it in that 20-minute silent prayer session, but down the road and over time, what begins to happen is, like, to use another metaphor, is like the light goes on, and you think, God's real. I'll be darned. And that's how it has been for me, although sometimes the more I practice contemplation, the more I do sit in silence in God's presence, I find that, there is something very tangible and real about just being with God. And God is experienced in this time of prayer too. And honestly, I can't really put words to it. Some writers are really gifted in that way historically. Throughout the Christian tradition, there have been some that are able to kind of articulate the inner experience. And that's really, when we're talking about mystical, we're not talking about woo-woo-y or new age or this kind of thing. We're just talking about the inner experience of God, the inner dialogue we have with God that happens sometimes in silence, other times, to use another example, would be like you experience it in nature, or laying there at night, putting your child to bed, or, I don't know, going on a walk or something. That it doesn't have... meditation is one route to get there, but you're coming to this experiential awareness of God's presence. That's the end game. That's the goal. And that's thoroughly Christ-like. Seriously, like you said, like this is not like we're throwing the Bible out. No, we're implementing it. And
sure.
And so Jesus himself, it says in the Gospels, he stayed up all night praying. And what was he doing? I'm sure he wasn't just chattering with God the whole time, but he was certainly in that awareness of that presence of God in that moment. So,
yeah. So, friends, if you're interested, that's a one-time workshop. I'm sure we'll repeat it at some point in the future, but you're welcome to join us on Sunday evenings, 5:00, room 205. So come check it out. All right, we're still in the season of Easter. Last Sunday was the third Sunday in Easter. That makes this Sunday the fourth Sunday. 50-day season leading up to Pentecost. And so I love to point that out, because we can quickly get beyond Easter, but as Christians, we really never do. We never do get beyond it on the calendar.
Well, it could be said that Easter is the central symbol of the Christian faith. A lot of times it's the cross, which is, of course, a helpful symbol as well. But ultimately, in the Protestant churches, Christ is not on the cross, right?
Right.
We're an Easter people. And so this idea of Easter, no, you can't encapsulate it in just one weekend a year. It's like this ongoing, like, understanding of things that is meant to come out of Easter Sunday.
Well, our text this week is from Acts, and it's a resurrection text. I mean, it's an Easter text because it's Luke who also wrote the Gospel of Luke. The same writer of the Gospel of Luke wrote Acts, and then this is Luke's description of Saul's encounter with the risen Christ, and so it fits the Easter scene. But you wanted to set the table for us this morning before we get into the text.
Yes, I mean, just to kind of hit on the text for a moment, and then I want to kind of backtrack. The Damascus story is famous. I mean, if you have some experience with Christianity, you're going to know about that story where Paul, at that time, Saul, is walking the road to Damascus, going down the road to Damascus, and he has an experiential kind of epiphany, awakening, and experience with the risen Christ where his life is altered and changed. Okay, so I think it's helpful for me to kind of preface all that with, what is the gospel to us? Because the Damascus story, it's not just Paul's story, it's our story. And that becomes more apparent when you understand the bigger picture of what the gospel is to us. So one of the things I love about this podcast, Randy, is that we're really here week after week. We're exploring an expression of Christianity that I think is a little bit unique in the sense of you don't hear this being talked about very often. There's some really good podcasts out there where, yes, they're talking about what I would describe as contemplative Christianity or mystical Christianity. But I would say it's kind of rare for Evansville, right?
Right.
And so, well, what are we talking about when we talk about the gospel? What are we talking about when we talk about our faith? I would suggest three big ideas. The first one is, as Christians, Christ is the lens. And by that, what I mean is, Randy, when I look at you and I say, I see Christ in you, I don't see a little baby Jesus in your heart. That's not it. No. When I say Christ is the lens, it's like Christ is the worldview that we're trying to cultivate within ourselves as a Christian people. It's this idea that our life is part of a greater life that's working in a Christ-like way. And so when I say, Randy, I see Christ in you, what I'm saying is I'm realizing that your life and my life, they're connected, and our relationship works best when we're working it out in a Christ-like way because we're a part of that greater life. And that idea is not just true for Christians. That's a universal truth that we as Christians are conveying, that, we're all connected to this greater life that we call God. To throw a biblical example of this out, just in terms of our conversation, the Apostle Paul, towards the end of Corinthians, has a really interesting passage. In 15, he says, Jesus has become a life-giving spirit. So when I say I see Christ in you, I'm aware of that life-giving spirit that we call Christ. We call Jesus. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is if Christ is the lens, then also back to Easter. Easter is the pattern. What do we mean by that? Well, it's not just an event of the past. Yes, Jesus, he rose from the dead. God raised Jesus from the dead. Absolutely, we're not denying that. But that moment is an affirmation of something that's happening everywhere and always. So Easter is much more than just something that happened a few thousand years ago. It's the affirmation of God's primary method of working in the world, which is God calls forth life again and again and again. It happened at the beginning of time. Of course, it happened in Jesus. It's happening here. It's happening now. All around us right now. Easter's happening where new life is springing forth. It's easy to see in spring, right? Like it's happening. And so what that means is new life can pop out in the most unlikely of situations, in the most unlikely of people. It can happen. New life can happen when we've even made big mistakes. God brings good out of even those things. And I'm sure you saw some of that when you were at the prison not long ago with Kairos. So Easter's the pattern, though. And there's always going to be new expressions of life to be seen and celebrated. That's the second thing. Okay, so if Christ is the lens, Easter's the pattern, then the last thing I will say, Randy, is love is the way. And love here is not like a warm and fluffy feeling. It's more like surrender. I'm surrendering to the flow of life. I'm surrendering to the new life that I'm seeing here now. I'm going to work for now the well-being of others and pay attention to the interruptions that happen along the way. And so really, if you put it all together, what we're saying is we're trying to cultivate a whole new mindset where we see our life in relationship with a greater life. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. Now, okay, let me just stop for a moment. What's the opposite of all this? Fundamentalism.
Mm-hmm.
That's the opposite. And what a fundamentalist mindset says is, I've got it all figured out. That does not compute with the software I just described at all. And I think in our world today, we're plagued by a fundamentalist mindset, because what a fundamentalist mindset says is, well, I've got it all figured out. I know the big picture. And it comes out in different ways. There's religious forms of fundamentalism, absolutely. But there's also academic forms of fundamentalism. There are political forms of fundamentalism, and the fruit is basically always the same. That's what I talked about in my sermon. It's like the wagons are circled, the borders are defended, and anyone that doesn't fit is persecuted. That's the sign of a fundamentalist,
right?
And so now this is a long way to get there, but we've arrived back to Paul, who is a case study in terms of what a fundamentalist looks like. Before Paul becomes Paul, he of course is Saul, and Saul, to use his own words, was zealous for the tradition of his ancestors to the point where he's willing to persecute this new form of Judaism called Christianity in his day. And so he persecutes them because they don't fit. He persecutes them because they go against the status quo. And and to me, this is just a haunting passage in Acts. It's Acts chapter 8, verse 1. You can look it up. He even approves of the execution of one of these early Christians named Stephen. Stephen, tradition tells us, is the first Christian martyr. And his job was to help the widows and the poor. That's his job. Now think about this. Saul approves of the execution of a man whose job was to help poor people. And but that's always it. How do you know you're in the presence of a fundamentalist? How do you know you've become possessed by a fundamentalism? You begin to approve of maybe not the execution, but the persecution of people who don't quite fit that box that you've created for yourself. That's always it. That's always it. And so, of course, Saul's life is changed, though, on his road to Damascus when the light of Christ begins to shine. And the question becomes, of course, what happens there?
How do we read it?
Yeah.
Okay, let's read it, and then we'll get into it. So this is from the 9th chapter of Acts. Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you were persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. Now there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, "Ananias." He answered, "Here I am, Lord." The Lord said to him, "Get up and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul. At this moment he is praying."
It's a wonderful story. Yeah. I'm glad you read it. That's good.
Not a conversion, a transformation.
And a calling.
Call.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Paul's not like switching religions here.
No.
I mean, that's often how we think of conversion today. It's like I was this religion, now I'm that religion, or I was non-religious, now I'm religious. No, that's not really what's happening here. He's a religious person whose religion is being expanded to see in a different way now. Mm-hmm. And the symbolism here is just it's so rich. He's blinded, right? Like he's walking along and he's blinded. And first he's healed spiritually, then he's healed physically and relationally. And so the spiritual healing happens when he asks the question, who are you? The voice says first, why are you persecuting me? And then Saul says, well, who are you? And it's like, I'm Jesus. And at that point, I think the light comes on for him. And the spiritual healing happens because it's in that moment the persecution stops. It all stops. Where he realizes that the God he thought he was serving is actually a part of these people too. Mm-hmm. And that's the light goes on in that moment. So the spiritual healing's there, but the physical healing doesn't really happen until 3 days after that. So he has to sit with it for a while. Mm-hmm. You know, again, the symbolism of 3 days is interesting to me. I'll throw that out there. But right. the healing happens when Ananias, who is a Christian from Damascus, one of the people that Saul is on the way, he's going to arrest this person, maybe kill him. Ananias is praying and has a vision of God. God speaks to Ananias and says, go pray for this person, Saul, which I'm sure if you're Ananias, I'm like, I'm not so sure about this one. And so, but Ananias gets up, he goes, and the symbolism is just striking here because Ananias goes and physically touches Saul, physically touches him, prays for him. And in that moment, the text, we didn't read it here, but it goes on to say, and scales fell from his eyes. Mm-hmm. And he began to physically see. And I think, to me, the deeper meaning of that moment is Saul is, in this moment, is relationally healed. With the community he once was at odds with and persecuting, that community now sees him not as an adversary, but as a friend. And so after all this happens, it says then that he's baptized and then he hangs out with the Christians. And so now he's a part of that community. And I think what we find here is just our own process of transformation. About the time we think we have it figured out, light goes on in a new way. We stop the persecution of those who are different than us. We begin to see certain people in new ways. And then really the scales fall off of our eyes when we relationally are healed with those folks. And we learn to see them as fellow travelers, really, along the journey.
You brought in, right at this point, Father Thomas Keating. And if you know him, if you're not Roman Catholic and you know him, you might know him because he really popularized the idea of centering prayer, which is a form of contemplative prayer. But you refer to him related to 4 questions, an exercise asking 4 questions, and the 4 questions are all the same.
It's the same question over and over again. Yeah. Who am I?
Yeah.
And it's a great meditation. So, imagine someone asks you the question, who am I? And you begin to share your name, and you give typically what happens when you meet someone, you give them the resume version of yourself, right? Just kind of that surfacey kind of, you're Randy Moore, I'm Andy Payton, I'm a pastor, you're a pastor, that kind of thing. But imagine, Keating goes on, imagine you're asked that question a second time, who are you? And then you're forced to begin to get into some of your unique things about you. By that I mean like your likes, your dislikes, those things that you enjoy, you don't enjoy. But then imagine you're asked that question a third time, who are you? And then you're forced to kind of get vulnerable and tell the story about how you came to be the person you are and like or dislike the things you like or dislike. And then imagine, he goes on, imagine you're asked a question the 4th time, if you're willing to play along.
If you're still there.
You're like, gosh, this is an odd conversation. and you're like, well, who am I? And apart from all these experiences you have, who are you, right? What's left? And at that point, now we're getting to the place where we're talking about this is the goal of the spiritual journey. Who are we apart from all these experiences and all these things and these groups we've identified ourselves with and all this stuff? Who are we? And the Christian tradition would say we are, I mean, some would say children of God. But if you really even push that farther, it would be something like, I think we're sinners embraced by the mercy of God. That's who we are. And so I find that idea of sin and sinner is helpful here, which I know there's going to be some listeners on this podcast who maybe you're going to push back on the idea. I don't like this idea I'm a sinner. I get that. I mean, that term has been used in some very unhealthy and unproductive ways, particularly where you see one group of people identifying another group of people as sinners, and the group of people who are doing this assume that they're right, that kind of thing. No, not helpful. To me, what is helpful about the idea of sin or sinner is I fall short. You fall short. Even on our best day, we don't quite hit the mark, and we have stuff left to learn. And that's such a helpful posture to have, because it assumes, and I think this is God's cure to our fundamentalism, it assumes I don't see the whole picture. I don't have it all figured out. I have something left to learn here. In the Methodist tradition, we talk about it in terms of going on to perfection. I never quite arrive. I go on to perfection. And so I assume I'm going to grow and change and adapt and evolve. Dare I say, be very cautious with a person who has never changed their mind. Right? Like, think about that for a moment. Have you, someone who can't tell you a time where they've actually changed their mind? That's someone who, I'm not going to call them a fundamentalist necessarily, but I would say that person is on the verge of mistaking their ego for the voice of God. Mm-hmm. It's very dangerous, very, very dangerous. So, it's this ongoing process of learning, though. That's who we are. Fellow travelers on the journey. And I find that meditation so helpful because of that.
You used a couple of stories to make your point. One had to do with National Day of Prayer and another with Wesselman Woods. Let's talk about those.
Okay. So I'll hit on the National Day of Prayer first. I'm on the Mayor's Interfaith Council, and Methodist Temple is really on part of the Mayor's Interfaith Council. So Randy, you participate some too. But I was invited to come and pray on Thursday, the National Day of Prayer. And there's folks from all across the board in terms of faith traditions, which is beautiful and wonderful. And one of my colleagues that participated that day with me told me the story of a parishioner, someone that he's worked with, that he personally knows, who, as a result of ICE and immigration enforcement in Evansville, this family has been completely disrupted. And some of the family members, I got the sense, were arrested, basically, by ICE. Mm-hmm. They had lived here for 20 years, church-going folks, had families. They weren't criminals, strictly speaking. And I just... to see the anguish on his face. Mm-hmm. And it pains me. I'll share this in the podcast. It pains me to even talk about this in sermon form. I mean, people say, well, you're being political. No, I'm trying to give expression to our faith, that if we really are a part of this life that transcends the borders of this world, then the stranger down the street who lives in the same city as us, their pain and their suffering should be important to us. I'm not trying to be political here. Mm-hmm. In fact, in the sermon, I said, regardless of where you're at politically, when you hear a story like that, you think, well, gosh, we could do better than that. And Randy, the thing that I struggled with a lot last week as all this ICE activity was happening in our city, I made the poor life choice of going on social media and Facebook, and I began to read some of the comments underneath these stories. And folks were just cheering this stuff on like it was the best thing that happened since sliced bread. And I thought, my gosh, even if that is the right thing to do, this is not something you cheer on. When we're cheering something like that on, when we're cheering on the suffering of other people like that, our hearts are not in the right place. No way. And I know there's some people who claim to be Christian on those threads. And I think to myself, how? How is that Christian? I'm not saying that God doesn't love you. God does love you, folks. I mean, if that's where you're at. But I have a hard time with that. And I mean, this is where the faith, the rubber meets the road, if we're going to take it seriously. And so I shared that story because it was just so fresh in my mind and my heart. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, it hit home, and it forced us to process it and to maybe reflect on where we stand on it. But as Christians, while we understand a need for protecting borders and all of that stuff, but at the same time, what is our approach? And I think we're back to love. It's got to come from there,
right,
and not from some, as you said, just these knee-jerk reactions and cheering this on. Even if you're for it, it's nothing to cheer about.
No.
Yeah.
No. You know, I mean, we all have our political beliefs, and I don't think the people who think politically differently than me are horrible and awful people. I don't believe that for a second. But this is the situation before us right now. So, yeah. That's one angle. The other angle was my Wesselman Woods experience. And really what I was doing in my sermon, whether it was Thomas Keating or the immigration story or I ended with this Wesselman illustration, I'm looking at the same thing from different angles, really. And so Friday I went to Wesselman Woods, which is one of our ministry partners here at Methodist Temple. If you don't know much about Wesselman Woods, it's really a unique thing about Evansville. Wesselman Woods is the oldest, I always get this wrong. Largest old growth forest inside of city limits within the United States. And so it's 200 acres. The second largest old growth forest within city limits is in the Bronx. It's like 55 acres. So just think about that. Anyway, I went to a presentation to represent the church, and the gentleman that was teaching it was wonderful. His name's Derek Walsh. He graduated from Harvard. He could use a lot of big words very quickly. And he talked about the difference between survival of the fittest versus survival of the friendliest. And as you look closely in terms of biology and the environment, it's more like survival of the friendliest, not necessarily the fittest. And so he went on to kind of describe different examples of how life and certain species interact with other species. One example would be a competitive relationship where two species, they compete for the same food source, which is kind of a lose-lose situation, because if you're not careful, you eat up all that food source and then, well, you starve, right? I mean, that's what's left. And then the other example he used was an exploitive situation where it's predator and prey, like a lion eats the gazelle, that kind of thing. And certainly, if you've ever watched National Geographic, you've seen those examples of that. And then, but then he got talking about mutuality, which is the one that's when I got my phone out and started taking notes, because I was like, man, that's good. It's where two species cooperate together, and they're both able to thrive. And the example he gave was blue jays. They have this capacity to they eat acorns, yes, but they also they can carry up to 5 acorns with them at a time. They have a little pouch in their throat. They're able to tuck them in there somehow. But anyway, they bury them everywhere. There's one study done where over the course of 28 days, 50 blue jays buried 150,000 acorns, and which is an extraordinary, number of acorns. And the funny thing about blue jays is that they only remember about 25% of the time where they buried them. So they're planting all these oak trees everywhere, basically. And then those oak trees, eventually some of them will grow and becomes habitat for them. And that's an example of mutuality. And both species are able to survive and thrive. Now, there's going to be some people who are going to push back at this illustration and say, okay, well, if the goal is mutuality, then how come in our world it's the competitiveness that keeps us going, right? And that's a fair observation and a fair argument. I'm not saying that competitiveness doesn't get us somewhere. I'm not saying that. But I'm going to say, in the long run, if you want to win, it's not competitiveness that's going to get us where we need to go. In fact, to use an analogy, I guess, the best way to be competitive is to be mutual and develop strong relationships and friends. And just use a sports analogy for a moment. The greatest teams are not about the superstar. Mm-hmm. They really aren't. The greatest teams are like, they're cooperative, right? They're mutual. And the best staff, the most effective staff, not siloed. Mm-hmm. They're not exploiting one another. They're not competing against one another. They're working together to fulfill a common mission and purpose. And just take that small example and then apply that to society. Let's be honest. A society that is competitive with one another or is exploiting one another, yeah, that's going to work for a while. But that's not going to work over the long haul. It's this mutuality that is really what enables us to work, in terms of longevity. And so how does this apply to what we've been talking about? Well, Paul is a case study in how to live a life of mutuality. How do you do it? Well, it starts with understanding that we don't see the entire picture. Just as Paul, he had the light go on and he realized that. 2, it continues when we are able to stop the persecution of folks that are different than us. Okay, not everyone's the same. Fair enough. And then 3, and really this is where it happens. 3, it's when that person that you once had that tendency to persecute comes over and then touches your life, that you're changed and you're transformed. And I find that's like the process of Easter over and over again. That it's that new life happening over and over again. And that's the contemplative posture. That's the mystical posture. My life is part of a greater life. And guess what? It always has something to teach me. And it typically happens through the people I meet along the way. And my whole life is an example of that at this point as a pastor. I became a Christian in my early 20s. I thought I had it all figured out. I was wrong. I began to see God's presence in other people of other faith traditions, and I couldn't deny it. Mm-hmm. Later it was like questions around gay marriage. I got expanded in that way. I finally said, well, I just can't condemn these people for loving one another. I can't do that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's like immigration. Like, what do we do there? And if I put myself in their shoes, if I allow their lives to come over and touch me, I think it seems obvious that we don't want to cause the suffering of these folks. It's not saying, we're not saying everything goes, I'm not saying that. We're not saying like get rid of the borders or anything like that, but there's a humane way to go about things. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I'm trying to say. But anyway.
Good stuff, Pastor Andy. And there will be more good stuff this Sunday. Not only is it the fourth Sunday in Easter, it is Mother's Day. And after Christmas and Easter, Mother's Day is a big one. So
we have a guest speaker.
Yes, we will.
One of our members is going to talk about her journey into motherhood. It's going to be good.
Absolutely. We look forward to that. We so much appreciate the fact that you're with us. And please know that you're invited to come and join us here in person anytime you'd like to. We worship on Sunday mornings, of course, at 8:30. That's our traditional service. And then our contemporary service is at 11. Some of you worship with us virtually, and that's fine too. But just know you're welcome to come and be a part of our community here at Methodist Temple. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
This has been the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. You are welcome to join us at Methodist Temple in person or online. Methodist Temple is at 2109 Lincoln Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. Our traditional Sunday morning worship service is at 8:30 with our contemporary service at 11. Log on to our website at methodisttemple.church. We see Christ in you.